Thank you. Our next speaker is a developer and designer. Faruk Ateş is the creator of Modernizr, and he'll be speaking with you today about that tool. Please welcome Faruk.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We've been hearing a lot about Modernizr. I'm Faruk Ateş, and I created it. But if you're in the US watching this presentation, it's going to be censored. All right, let's not do censorship, everyone. I don't think those lines were visible anymore, but it doesn't matter. What is Modernizr? So, it's HTML5. It's an open source library, JavaScript, for making HTML5 and CSS3 websites and really taking advantage of these technologies today. So, that's conceptual. How do you actually do that? Well, we do it through feature detection. You've been hearing about feature detection a lot over the past 2 days. Modernizr is how you actually do these things very easily, very fast, and very efficiently. So, what does Modernizr detect? It detects a whole bunch of features, like really basically everything in HTML5, CSS3, and all these related technologies that people are currently putting into browsers. And it's too much for the slides. There's well over 50 tests in Modernizr for a whole bunch of things. So it's the library to go to if you want to start doing all of these really cool things and all these really cool techniques that you've been seeing today and yesterday. So what do you do with the data? Because it's great that it detects all this stuff, but what do you do with it? It basically makes this data available to you in 2 different ways. The first is a global JavaScript object, which will have a bunch of properties on it, one for each test, and each property will be either true or false, depending on whether the browser actually supports that feature. So in this case, or in this example, we have modernizr.css transitions, and that'll be either true if the browser supports it, or false if the browser doesn't. The other way is, and this is something we encourage you to do, is to put class Node.js on your HTML element at the very top of your page, so that you have a hook for styling the page if JavaScript is somehow disabled in the browser. Some people do it. Sometimes it's a proxy that filters JavaScript out. So you can sort of use that as a fallback. Then if JavaScript runs, we replace it with just regular JS. And then we add all these classes for all of the features we detect. And then if the browser doesn't support it, we prefix it with no and a hyphen. If it does, we don't. You just get it. So in this example, we see there's no touch events, which you just saw talk about. So we have a test for that. But we do support CSS transitions. We support add font face, no 3D transforms, and so forth. So this allows you to do forking in both your JavaScript code using the JavaScript object, as well as kind of if-else conditions in your CSS. You can say hey, in this case we do this, in that case we do that. A bit of an example. So here we have some great div, looks fantastic. We have a nice box shadow here, and as you can see, it has a nice blur effect on it. It's very pretty. Ooh. But what do we do if the browser doesn't support box shadow when we want to have something there to sort of keep that design aesthetic alive? Well, we can say no box shadow. And then on that same div, we just say, OK, we do a border bottom and a border right, and we kind of mimic it. It's not the same. I mean, you can see it's that's really not quite as pretty. But the general feel of the design remains intact. And we just fall back gracefully to some alternative solution. It may not be as nice, but at least we can maintain the experience in a good way. And what's critical in this example is we don't just want to do a fallback that, or we don't just want to use these CSS3 features, for instance, in a way that, just use it, and if the browser doesn't understand it, it'll ignore it, because we want to apply the border only if the browser doesn't support it. We don't want that border to be there all the time. We only want it if the browser doesn't support box shadow. So that's kind of this, that's a great sort of if-else example where you can really tailor the experience. And this is also important for accessibility because we have some white-on-white text here, but we can still read it. But what if the browser doesn't support text shadow? Probably cannot read it, right? So then we can say, oh, well, if you have no text shadow, we just change the color to something else so that people can still read it. And we may compromise the design a little, but we can make sure that things still work. We don't break the experience for people, even though we're taking advantage of like really latest and greatest stuff. So Modernizr is all about making tailored experiences a lot easier for you to do. And that is really empowering. There are 3 more reasons. The first is it makes this a whole lot easier to build forward-compatible experiences. And what I mean by that is, when you create something and you take advantage of like really cutting-edge stuff, and you go and put this like fantastic experience for your website or your web application, maybe only like 5% or 10% of your audience can see all the features right now. But as people upgrade their browsers, if you build them with Modernizr in this sort of feature detection approach, they will automatically start to get these better experiences, whether or not, or without you having changed anything. So your audience upgrades their browser, which they do eventually at some point. Suddenly your website or application looks way better, works way faster, stuff like that, and you didn't change the line of code. So you spend a little bit more time up front building the experience this way, and suddenly it pays off over time more and more and more to more and more of your audience. So that's a really powerful thing. It's also better for the web, because if you start toying around with all these great new technologies that we've been seeing, they're not quite fully baked yet, right? There are all little bugs here and there. We just had a big bit about the audio API being pretty incomplete, and you start playing around with this stuff, you uncover bugs. You report these bugs to the browser vendors, hopefully, which you should. And when the browser vendors then fix those bugs, their browser is going to be a much more robust browser, which means users are going to get a better experience because their browser won't have issues or won't crash, stuff like that. And if users get a better experience, that's also generally better for the web, because that means more people upgrading the browsers, getting better experiences, also will convince more people to start using these technologies. So everybody wins in this, right? And the third reason is very important. Pink is the new hotness. There's another part to Modernizr, and that is bringing an end to user agent sniffing. This is a practice that has been around for about 14 years and has been biting people in the ass ever since day one. It's very easy to get this wrong. It's almost impossible to get this stuff right, because for the longest time, browsers have been lying more and more in their user agent string, and keeping up with it is almost impossible. And this is just like the latest Chrome, but if you look closely, you see 6 different browser IDs in this string. And that changes all the time, and there are literally thousands of different user agent strings out there. And in order to make any sense out of it, you have to basically spend a full time, like 50 hours a week just keeping up with it. And it's just so not worth it. It causes a lot of problems, has created a lot of problems on the web itself. So Modernizr is also kind of a way for people to say, hey, let's no longer do this. We have better techniques now, and it's easier. I mean, what is that? There's some stuff, some fundamental stuff that Modernizr doesn't do, which is it doesn't make older browsers support all of these new things from CSS3 and HTML5. With only one exception, really, and that is the HTML5 shiv. We have that built in. What it does is it enables the use of the new HTML5 semantic elements in IE. IE 6, 7, and 8 don't understand any kind of tags that are not in the HTML4 specification. So if you start using HTML5 semantics, IE just goes, what? What's this? The problem is it creates a broken DOM, which will break your JavaScript and your CSS styling. So you really don't want to do that without using a shiv. And so Modernizr will also kind of like fix IE 6 through 8 in that sense. So that's good. But beyond that, it doesn't actually all by itself. It doesn't add any new functionality to browsers. Using it the right way, like any tool, you can use it sort of the wrong way. The best way to use Modernizr is to design for the browser of the future. And I'll talk more about this in a moment, but conceptually and at the core, this just means design for features. Design content for the most amazing experience you can think of, using whatever features are currently available in at least one browser, and preferably standardized in at least a proposal to the W3C. And then as you design it, you build this experience, you're building for this experience that more and more people will automatically get. But it might be that right now only 5–10% of your audience is going to get it. You also want to sort of like really take this very strong and aggressive approach to feature detect to see if either a feature is present or if it's missing. And you want to focus on speed and performance rather than visual consistency. And that's actually a very critical thing, more and more so with some stuff that's coming up. So designing for the browser of the future. Well, 3 years ago, which browser came out? Like a new browser? Anyone? Chrome, right. So 3 years ago, they had 0% market share. Right now, they have 25% market share worldwide. And 3 years is a really long time. There's lots of websites out there today that are built 3 years ago. They're still live and being used today. The technology stack hasn't changed much, if at all, right? So if you build it 3 years ago and you focus on browsers rather than features, you'd be saying, oh, well, we have Firefox, IE, and Safari, and Opera, and that's it. And now there's this whole new browser that's actually a quarter of the market. Things change really fast on this platform. And we tend to focus on our browser statistics that we have today. We look at the stats, we look at the market shares for each browser, and then kind of go back to the past 3 years, what it was like. But what we should focus on is everything that's happening today and that might happen over the next 3 years. And the problem with thinking in terms of browsers is that you cannot predict what the browser market exactly is going to look like 3 years from now. It's really impossible to say, well, 3 years from now, Chrome is going to have X% of the market or whatever. But what we can say is 3 years from now, it's almost guaranteed that every browser is going to have a solid implementation of CSS transitions. It's almost guaranteed that they will have a solid implementation of HTML5 input elements for these things, and so forth and so forth. So if you focus on features, you have much more of a guarantee that it'll work, that your work is forward compatible, and that people are just going to get a better experience. And again, you don't have to do anything for it other than this upfront work. Feature detecting for features being either present or missing, sometimes you need to have a pretty low baseline for a project that you're working on. Maybe a client says, no, we absolutely must support this. Then it's very useful to use Modernizr to just say, hey, progressively enhance this if the feature X is present, and then we go and make something more on top of it, but you sort of built this base version first. You can also do the graceful degradation approach, where you just imagine the most amazing experience possible and use Modernizr to detect when things aren't present and sort of make sure that the experience doesn't break for anyone in older browsers. And the third technique is kind of regressive enhancement, which I kind of think of going mega responsive. We've heard some stuff about responsive web design already, so I won't go into that. But this basically is a combination of Modernizr and yep-nope.js, which we actually include as modernizr.load. And it is conditional dynamic resource loading. And what that means is you can actually say, hey, if you support X feature, load this JavaScript or load that JavaScript or load this CSS and load that. Which is great for using with polyfills. Polyfills themselves, basically a small JavaScript library that shoehorns new functionality into older browser. So in a sense, the opposite of what Modernizr does. They can be extremely useful, but I'll actually show some example first. Here we have a simple Modernizr geolocation test. And we say, if the browser supports it, then yep, we load this this JavaScript file that takes advantage of it. If the browser doesn't, we load this polyfill that sort of works around the fact that the browser doesn't actually have support for geolocation. A more comprehensive example is the HTML5 forms polyfill, which tests for a whole bunch of different things with Modernizr and goes like, oh, hey, you support input types email and this and that. And if you don't support any or all of these, we load in this polyfill for forms that retroactively adds support for these new HTML5 forms features. And then there's a callback to initialize the whole thing. But that brings me to speed and visual consistency. People don't come to your site and go like, oh, I wonder what this looks like in IE6. They don't arrive to open it in a different browser. They arrive for the content. But they will leave very quickly if your site is slow. If your site takes 15 seconds between each page load or each click on the page because you have all these polyfills loaded, and it's great that you did border radius in IE6, but you now made it so slow for the user that they are going to leave because they don't want to sit there waiting for your border radius to sort of render pixel by pixel. So really get into the mindset of sacrificing visual consistency if it impedes the speed and performance of your website, because you're going to lose users a lot faster by slowness. And there's some examples of how to sort of use Modernizr. And this is an example from my own site where the base version is kind of oh, we have a hover, it's a different color, it's nice. But it's not very exciting, it's not very engaging, it's not a lot of fun. So I have a second version that applies if your browser supports border radius and if it supports RGBA, so we can do transparent colors. And I'm going to zoom here for a bit so you can kind of see, you can see that this is slightly transparent. So in the case of your browser supporting that and supporting border radius, what we're actually doing is we change the nature of this hover into something that is wider so that this icon moves a little. And we add this border radius so you can really see the effect nicely. Then we take it even further where, if you also support transitions, now we're cooking. Right? Now we have some fun things, and we make each hover go even wider, and it's all very simple stuff. These are just a couple of lines of CSS that just go, hey, do you also support CSS transitions? Then make it a little bit wider still, and add a transition in between the two states, and some box shadow and all that. It's really nice. So these are three different experiences. They look different visually, they interact different, but they are very similar. There's a consistency between them, and they are super easy to do, and they really take advantage of just simple Modernizr and styling hooks to really enhance this experience for people using better browsers. Then there's a more comprehensive example of using Modernizr load, where we actually do this on our own site. We test to see if the browser supports at font face, but is not a touch device, because we don't really want to put too much pressure in font rendering and all the other stuff that we're doing on mobile devices. And so if that's the case, you're on a desktop browser and you support at font face, we load typekit and we initialize it, and you get nice, rich typography. And then we go on and we do, hey, do you also support transitions and transforms? And if so, we load some extra CSS that does a bunch of animation stuff, because that stuff is really not necessary if your browser doesn't support these things, either of these things. It's just a bunch of effects. We don't need it. And then you can also see some normal scripts being included, like in analytics and our own custom code. And those are just a part of it. Again, you can just include these. What's great about the whole Modernizr.load approach is that it loads all of these files in parallel to the browser rendering engine doing its thing. So they don't block the render from rendering the page for the user. It loads them in parallel in the background, and you can still make things get parsed in order if you want. So it's actually a really, really good way of doing this, especially if you get more complicated resources and permutations of your design. Getting started, basically, go to modernizr.com. and download it. And we have two versions. We have the development version. It's raw, JavaScript, has all the tests in it. It's good for learning. You can see a lot of stuff, how we do it, and some techniques in there. It's also good for deployment of content distribution networks and some limited control cases like contests, maybe, where you don't have full control over the stuff you include. Also very useful for JS Fiddle. Who's familiar with JS Fiddle and similar stuff? OK, so these are simple little JS Fiddle is like this platform where you can just do quick little tests of code and execution and styling. It's really useful to include it on there. But if you would do a production build, we actually make you do a custom build where you only select the tests that you actually need for your website or application, so that the footprint of the library is as small as it can be and execution time is as minimal as it can be. So we kind of actually enforce that performance improvement. And we also encourage you to self-host it because of the HTML5 shift being in there. If you use the new semantics, you really want to have this block the rendering for IE and not be sort of like parallel on anything. And that's it. That's basically the rundown from start to finish. So thanks. Glad we did great on time. So we have time for questions. If anyone wants, I think there's mics.
Hi, great product. Have you guys thought about integrating Modernizr with the Warful project, or have you looked at that?
Which project?
The wireless resource thing where they've captured all the properties and the profiles of wireless devices and offered them up as a big XML file. They're basically server-side interrogation of the user agent string.
Right. We have not. It's kind of a separate approach, and we kind of really want to encourage the whole feature detection aspect rather than anything with user agent strings. There are some edge cases where user agent string sniffing is still kind of necessary, but they're getting rarer and rarer. So, any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, George Smith. I was wondering, the talk this morning about ARIA and the detection there, are you including that in Modernizr, or is it already there?
We don't actually have a whole lot of stuff for that in there yet. We are planning on adding it.
What? The high contrast test?
It's difficult for some of them. And we're also, currently have this thing where we have a lot of tests in there in a sort of a separate community folder, so that people can just contribute their own tests for Modernizr. But so many people have been doing that, we have a hard time keeping up with it. And we are trying to get a sort of a better approach to managing this wide variety of tests and make it easier for people to just add their own tests and add a whole selection of tests like the ARIA stuff. So that's in the works, but not in there just yet, right now. Any other questions? Cool, I think that's it. Awesome. Thanks.